Welcome to Faithful Understanding, a podcast where we talk about Christianity and faith and how it interacts with the culture around us today. Today I'm joined by Andrew McKerrow. Andrew became New Zealand's first racing chaplain in 2015 and in 2024 has accepted a full-time ministry role through the Salvation Army to continue his pastoral care in the Christchurch area. Andrew has been entrenched in the racing industry for more than 35 years, beginning his career as an aspiring apprentice jockey, but finding his true calling in supporting and caring for people within the racing community. Andrew, welcome.
Good to be here. Thanks, Ethan.
Cool. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your work as a chaplain in this industry? What is that? What does it mean for you? What is your day-to-day?
It's a common question. I was sitting on an aeroplane probably about a month ago and somebody said, "What do you do for a job?" I said, "I'm a racing chaplain." And they went blank and glazed over like a donut and said, "What is that?" So I've had to practice explaining it a bit. So basically, my role is just care and support for people in the racing industry across the coast. So we have greyhound racing in New Zealand, we have harness racing, we have thoroughbred racing. So my role is just really to make sure that people are noticed, cared for. There's a pretty good two-way conversation happening, which is really good. So sometimes people will come to me and seek me out. But for me, good chaplaincy is about trying to just loiter at the right time in the right place, so that you can see who needs a chat, who needs somebody to sort of come alongside.
Right. Yeah. And so you've been doing this for a while. Was it something that you found came quite naturally to you, or is it something that you've had to really work at over the years?
I think for me it comes really naturally. It feels like a sweet spot. It doesn't feel like work. It's, in fact, I'll pinch myself some days and kind of go, who would be stupid enough to pay me to do this? It's the work I love, but it's also the industry that I really care about. So for me, it's quite a powerful combo.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your history in this role. How did you choose this industry? How did you decide this is where you wanted to be?
I kind of didn't. Like, it chose me. I went in really blind. At the end of school cert, let's go back a wee way when it was even called that, my teacher suggested that maybe it wasn't a good idea that I keep coming to school. And so I went home and passed that information on to my parents, who said, if you leave, that's fine, but you've got to have a job first. So the next day I went into the school library, and there was this ad, and even to this day, this is weird to me. All of the ad said was, "Are you short? Do you weigh under 48 kilos? And do you like being outside?" And I just said, yes. Apply in writing too. No idea what the ad was, what the job was, sorry. And I think a week later I signed the jockey's apprenticeship. And so I knew about racing because we kind of grew up in a typical Kiwi rugby racing and beer type home, you know. But I had no aspirations of ever being a jockey or knowing how to be a jockey. Didn't grow up with horses. My first day in the job, I had to mix horse feeds in the morning. And I got home that night and I was like, I couldn't breathe properly.
Right.
And turns out that I was allergic to horse feed. So that was strike one. That was day one. And then day two, they chucked me on a horse. And I had an incident when I was younger, like a newborn, and it led to an infection in my shoulder. So I've got one arm shorter than the other.
Right.
So when I would try and ride the horse, I would kind of, it felt fine to them, but in my head, I was kind of like, they can tell that I'm lopsided, you know? So I would change my hold on the reins to try and even it up. And what they didn't tell me is on a racehorse, if you do that, that means move, go. And as soon as you let the tension off on the rein. So I spent most of my life just bolting or riding just blindly around tracks and being terrible at it. And after you do that 4 or 5 times, you get a natural fear, which a horses almost smell before you even get on them. So I would bolt on horses that they said wouldn't even know how to bolt, with any gift really. But I was pigeonholed in a sense on the fact that here I was in this industry of less school, I had no other options, and so I hung around for about 3-4 years. I loved the horses, still do. But when it came to riding them, just the ability and the confidence wasn't there.
Right.
So I continued to sort of, my friend group continued to be sort of racing people. So I continued to sort of attend races, be interested in races, love races. I think it's one of those industries where there's something about just, I don't know, being on a racetrack and being around those magnificent creatures, it captures you. And even if you're useless like I was, you don't want to let it go.
Yeah.
So after about 4 years, I then changed job options, but continued to love racing and love the people in it probably more than anything. Fast forward to 20, I become a Christian on the toilet floor of a pub. Yeah, another story for another time, actually. And that just completely changes my whole life trajectory, really. End up getting into youth work. I met my wife, we train and become ministers. And I loved that work, but the very first place that we got sent as ministers was the very last place that I was an apprentice jockey. That was Foxton, North Island.
Right.
And so back then, the Salvation Army was still very active in pubs. They would go around with our magazines and talk to people in the pubs and collect money and all the rest of it. And of course, here's all these old racing guys that I knew sitting in the pubs, and I reconnected them very quickly. And it started something in me that kind of sort of said, these are my peeps. This is my people. And here I am in this role that's about loving and serving in others, and there's nobody kind of doing it for these guys, It is a tough industry, and I know because I've been in it, so I start to pray. I say, Lord, what would it look like to serve this industry? And so continue to just do the church work. We get shifted to Wanganui, and there's a bigger racetrack. And so after a little bit, I had friends here, and I went to the racing club, and I said to them, look, I don't know what it looks like yet, but I just have a heart to want to just be helpful to the people on the racetrack. And they said, just tell us what you want to do. So I said, how about if I come down on a Friday morning, pretty early, because they start pretty early, and throw the barbecue in the back of the van, and we'll cook breakfast once a week and just use that as a way to connect with people and do something that's helpful. So that went on for about maybe 2-3 years while we were there. And then after we left and came home to Christchurch, we were quite burnt out from the ministry in the church. And it was probably had about a 2-year break. And I was sitting in my office. By this stage, we were just helping the assistant pastors in another church. And I just felt God say, today's the day. And I'm kind of like, for what? And he's like, ring the racing industry. So I called them. It was a funny conversation, and that just kind of led to them agreeing to explore what chaplaincy could look like.
Right.
We had good links already with Rick at a racetrack from the past, and they agreed to let me come and use them as guinea pigs, basically.
Good.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Right. And so what would you say in your work that you've done is, well, what are some of the problems that jockeys and people in the industry, what sort of things do you find they struggle with the most?
Well, I think it's probably the stuff that's just common to all of us.
Right.
So a lot of what we're dealing with is common life stuff. It may be that, I don't know, maybe a sort of bit of crisis hits, and just those basics like not looking after ourselves, or finding ways to cope, which probably aren't the most healthy things. But it can be as simple as somebody gets a medical diagnosis, and it turns their world upside down.
Right. So
it's just, again, sometimes it's not even initiated by them. You're just close enough to see that the person just doesn't seem right in themselves. And you want to kind of just explore that a little bit and say, what is it that you're carrying, you don't see in yourself? And that usually leads to a cup of coffee and a chat. And
right.
Sometimes it's big stuff, but often it's just kind of like life is just kind of throwing a spanner at me right now.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
One of the probably unique, not just to racing, but more pronounced to racing, is there's a lot of crisis stuff. It's a dangerous sport. And so I do a lot of hospital visitation.
Right.
And we've had to do a lot of funerals for people, which is pretty tough. So deaths in racing of jockeys, thank goodness, are not common, but they they really rock the industry when it happens.
Mm.
So that's been probably the hardest thing, but also the most privileged. They're the times we want to be there.
Yeah.
To be able to just make sure that good pastoral care happens when something happens to a group of people that affects them so deeply, really.
Mm.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when I read that you were the first chaplain in this industry, it actually kind of surprised me, because I thought that in an industry where it is quite volatile, like things can happen, and people go through all sorts of stuff. You know, other sports have chaplains, they have people that, you know, these
Wellness programs.
Yeah. Yeah, and so when I read that you were the first, I thought, wow, you know, what happened before you? You know, how did these people handle?
We just sucked it up and moved on, and there was very much a culture of that, and there's still remnants of that too, where that kind of just take a concrete pill and harden up, because that was the only option, right? It's not that we're greatly ignorant about that. It's just there was no other things. That's what we had to do. When there was a death, what care and support was provided was basically sort of none, apart from the checking in amongst one another. That would be it. One of the challenges too with racing is it doesn't sleep, it doesn't stop. So you might lose a comrade, you know, on the track on a Monday, and you're riding again on Saturday. And so the industry just, it doesn't break. It's relentless. And so I think that's been a real challenge too, is trying to help people to find even room to process grief when we've never really done it before.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So it's about, you're trying to create a new culture.
It's exactly what we're trying to do, is just to create, well, at the very least, just put new elements into the culture. That can help the existing culture at the least, you know.
Yeah, and have you found much success in that?
I think we're seeing that now. I think there's more troops arriving, which is exciting as well. So last year, the racing industry commissioned somebody to come up with a wellbeing program for the whole of racing, and that's really exciting. So there's going to be a lot more resources. So instead of just me flitting around the whole country doing my best to kind of do damage control everywhere, we'll be able to be a bit more proactive. So they'll have social worker on staff, where at least it's how I understand it, but they'll also have field workers who are trained in just sort of basic, I suppose, sort of emotional first aid, suicide awareness, those kind of issues. So that there's people amongst them all the time, which is really good. So the more, the better.
Yeah.
But I think we've been a bit probably blessed in that we've got a lot of mileage out of what we've been doing so far, but there's lots more to do.
Sure. I would like to talk a wee bit about addiction, and I have heard through people, mutual friends that we have, that you're someone that has a wealth of knowledge and experience around this issue. So tell me about your experience with addiction. Have you been through it yourself? Have you worked with other people that have been through it?
Both. So probably ages 12 through to 22, had 10-year period, and I was kind of deeply addicted to just about everything I could find. So for me, I think there's always the age-old debate: is it nature or is it nurture? You know, are you kind of predisposed to it, or do you learn it? And I think it's both.
Right.
I can certainly see addiction was really strong in my father's family line, and it affected right throughout our family, and it was around me. So I think it was a bit of both. So I got addicted initially to gambling at the age of 12, because back then there was no age limit on poker machines.
Okay.
So they just used to be sit in hamburger bars.
Wow.
So I used to do paper rounds. I would finish my paper round, I'd get my pay, and I would go straight to the pokies. So one-up bandits and just into it.
Yeah.
I think probably by the age of 14, I didn't like to go a day without a game. And then by the time I was 16, it was full-fledged.
Right.
By the time I was 17, I was starting to find creative ways and not always honest ways to keep gambling. And then alongside that, probably formed the drinking and the drugs, partly to probably cope with what was happening with my gambling addiction, and partly just because I could, probably because I've got that nature.
Sure.
So even now, I'm so aware that I have to manage that addictive part of me. I find I'm kind of just predisposed to anything that,
sure.
you know.
Okay. So do you have like boundaries or sort of things that you have in mind that you're like, oh, okay, I'm going into a pub, there's poker machines here, there's lots of alcohol here, I need to make sure that I'm doing this so I don't fall back into this?
Not now. For the first probably 10 years, those things were really important to me, to make sure that there was lots and lots of safety measures that I put in place. Part of that was recognising what my triggers were. But as my recovery grew, and particularly as my faith grew, that part of me, in a sense, just kind of died off.
Right.
It's not lost on me probably either how ironic it is that now I'm back in the racing industry, and working on racetracks full time up until this year, without a thought, without even kind of going, oh, you know,
right,
a flinch, which is crazy to me.
That's amazing.
I think a good part of that was recovery to get me to that point. But I think for me, my Christian faith, where God talks about having the ability to make us new, is a big part of it too, I think, for me.
Yeah. So talk me through a little bit your initial steps into recovery.
Yeah.
So was it other people that brought it up? Was it one day you just decided enough is enough? Was it a slow progression over time? What was...
It was an enough is enough moment, which I never expected to have, because I loved gambling. Like I did it because I loved doing it. There wasn't... I knew that it was having a catastrophic effect on my life, but I enjoyed it more than I was worried about that.
Right.
So I had, I suppose you call it a sort of a Damascus Road type experience in a pub on a toilet floor. Just came out of the blue, and I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I didn't have a lot of, if any, thought about God at all. But this particular day, this particular moment, I just sort of found myself having this conversation with God in the toilet in the pub. And the question that he sort of put to me was, "Are you done?" And I thought about it, and I was, but I didn't feel comfortable admitting that.
Yeah.
Because even though I'd made this car wreck of my life, and that was a picture that God used to show me in my head was of a car wreck, I didn't like to sort of say, I can't fix that myself. Well, maybe I can just get the dents out of the fender and then you can take it from there. But there was something probably a bit prideful and probably a bit ashamed in me that kind of says, I've stuffed this up so bad. I'm not sure how I feel about giving this wreck to somebody else to fix, particularly somebody I don't know, because I don't know God. I just know he's there. There's a sense of, there's a lot of stuff going on in that moment. But I make this decision to go, yes, I'm done. Followed up by another question, which God was, well, if you would trust me with this wreck, this car, which was happening in this picture in my mind, which is your life. It's up to me to get the dents out. It's up to me to do something with it. All you have to do is give me the keys. So I did that, the best I knew how. Didn't understand what to do next or what Christians do. I just said yes. I didn't bounce into faith. I didn't have another account like that again for about a year and a half. But what did happen was the very next day, I finished work. I was walking to a bus stop, and I saw somebody on the way who I used to know, and who had a chronic gambling problem.
Right.
And they said, I'm going to this group. Do you want to come tonight? And that was in. So that was the beginning of my recovery journey for my gambling.
Mm-hmm.
As that resided, I started to cross-addict. So I was gambling less, but I was drinking more.
Right.
Or I was gambling and drinking less, but I was starting to smoke weed again. So it was all these things that just continue to sort of cope on my own, as opposed to finding healthy ways to cope. So that was probably about a 1.5-year process before those things started to sort of get into check better.
Okay. And so when was the moment in your recovery that you decided, God, all of this I'm just going to give to you?
Yeah. Look, it would have been about 1.5 years, 2 years in the 12-step program, which we were really fortunate in that the group that I was part of was sort of an experimental group. So where a lot of people would rely on AA programs or GA programs, which are fantastic, but they're very much just person-led. We're really lucky that this group had a clinical psychologist who was leading it. So it would run like a group, but he would also be available for one-on-one counselling. So we're going a lot deeper rather than just talking about the steps every now and then. We were working them with a professional. So it was really lucky. I was comfortable with all the talk of God and higher power because I'd met him. I had no problem with that. I just didn't know much about him.
Sure.
There came a point for me about 1.5 years, 2 years in, where I was enjoying recovery, but it was starting to feel really suffocating. So it was like the whole point of my life had now become about just being set free from something. I appreciated that, but it felt like the story was too small to live in. I kind of had this nagging thing that said, you've been set free from something because you've been set free for something. And so I wanted to know what I was set free for, because I was starting to get a little bit claustrophobic of just thinking the rest of my life is about just not doing this thing.
Yeah.
Like it's got to be bigger than that. And so within that, I knew that God had the answer to that, however and whoever he was. When I was young, I did a paper round, and there was a lady on my paper round that I would meet with every day, because the paper boy before me said, this lady will give you an orange juice and a biscuit if you take the paper in. So her and her husband were incredible people. They were Christians, and they never preached to me at all, but I knew they went to church, and I knew they were good people. So I knocked on her door, and I said, I want to go to church. I've got some stuff going on, and I need to find out, more about, who this God was that bumped into me in the toilet and what I do about that. So she took me to Salvation Army of Belfast. I guess if you take me to the Anglican church, I'll be Anglican. I don't know, but that was where she went. So that's where she took me. And the Salvation Army fitted me in a lot of ways, naturally, which made it easier. And so began this journey of starting to figure out not just what am I set free from, but what am I set free for? What does God want to do with this? Because that early picture, right, was of God saying, I want to do something with this thing. I want to get it straightened out, but I want to make something with it, which was me. So I wanted to find out what that was. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and so do you feel like you've reached that moment where God has said to you, this is what you are working for now. This is what I want you to do?
There are times where I think so, and then it changes, and I think so about that as well. So we weren't expecting to get back into full-time ministry, pastoring, and I love that so much. But if you'd have said to me a year ago, I'm like, no, because I would never leave this racing work. Like, this is the sweetest spot that I've ever felt. So for me, it's about just remaining really open to God. And then saying, Lord, I even though I love this thing, it's really important to me that you help me to keep my hands open. So that if you want to take something out of them, that's okay. But if you want to put something in them, that's okay too. Because if it's left to me, I'll pitch where I'm comfortable. and I'll stay there. So there are times where I think, this is it, man. This is I've arrived. This is what I've been set free for. This is my purpose. This is my God spot. But then it changes, and you go, and so is this. So for me, it's about staying continually open to what God wants to do. I love what we're doing now. And I kind of go, well, this is the sweet spot, because now I'm doing both of these things that I love. I'm still doing Race Street Ministry, and I'm pastoring, and I'm loving every day of it. But who knows? In 3 years, that might look different again. So for me, it's more about, I don't want to put too much of a lid on what that being set free for is. Lord, whatever it is that you've got, just help me to stay available, I think.
So the next thing I want to touch on is I kind of want to break down why or how people become addicted to things. I've noticed personally that a lot of people start at a young age where they haven't really figured out the consequences of actions. Like if I go into this, then this is going to end up happening because, they're a bit young. But also people who have traumatic experiences and are just latching onto something that takes away the thought of whatever it is they're going through. Yeah, what do you think?
I think it's all of those things. I think for some people, it's a great escape. I think for other people, it's a distraction. I think for other people, they just love doing whatever their addiction is. People who like to drink really like getting drunk. People who love to gamble really like gambling, or else we wouldn't do it, But I think ultimately what those things are doing is they're bringing us a certain amount of pleasure or escape, or they're a coping mechanism. They're sort of saying, compared to whatever this is, this feels better. And when I'm doing this, I don't think about anything else. I think for me, that's probably what it was. It was crowd control in my head. I had a lot going on in my growing up years. And if I was just doing this, I wasn't having to think about that. And I think, too, as I've learned more about who Andrew is and learned that, certainly in later years, I've been diagnosed with an ADHD brain. And knowing that a big part of that is that I'm very impulsive.
Sure.
And so that impulsivity, that appeals to me. The fact that I can just feel like I want to go and do that, and I could just go and do it. The flip side, the downside to that is that we're not very good at saying no to things. So I think that probably created a perfect storm for me. But I know for some people, they'll gamble because, or drink or drug because their friend group sort of pressures them in. So I think there can be, so there's a sense of, if I do this, then I'll fit in. So initially they'll do it to fit in, and then after a while, the addiction takes hold, and then you've got a new problem. So I think there's probably lots of reasons. I think the underlying thing for all of it is that when I'm doing this, I feel better. Even if I feel worse afterwards, I feel good at the time.
Yeah, just on that, being around people that do it.
Yeah.
I think I can't remember who said it, but there's a saying that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And so if you're around people that all they're doing is gambling or drinking or whatever it is, then you're more likely to do something like that.
I think it very much depends on where you're at in terms of your own sense of security. So when I was an addict, that was very much true. I surrounded myself with addicts and addictive behaviour because then that made me feel better about what I did. But the irony is now I spend just as much time with people who are rat bags or just good people struggling with stuff. I spend time with lots of people who drink like a fish. And and I don't feel that they change my character any. So I think it's both. I think it's more about where your character is at the time. You tend to gravitate towards that. But I think you can still be a person who's come through those things and still be surrounded by people. I think particularly in terms of faith, Jesus was labelled as a friend of sinners, right? And I know there was a time where it wouldn't have been good for me to engage back in that world. But as God continues to just do a work, for me at least, there was always, I think, a mandate to return back to that. Because I come back, but I'm a different Andrew.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's both. I think if you're vulnerable, you need to be really smart and wise about who you surround yourself with, like you say. But if you move to a place of strength, I think you can then be the person who influences rather than being influenced yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's on a bit of a spectrum in terms of self-awareness when someone is addicted, and also self-control, or where they find, I don't want to say value, but it's where they find their comfort in terms of, is it in their addiction or is it somewhere else?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that seems like it's on a bit of a spectrum. Yeah, what do you...
Self-awareness for me is the key to everything. So I remember working with a jockey who had a really crippling addiction, and we linked that person up with somebody who was a alcohol and drug counsellor. So he was working with a counsellor who was asking, like trying to identify feelings, and he just, honest to God, didn't know what they were. There was a chart of smiley faces, sad faces, all these things. And it would have taken, I was sitting with the person, it would have taken 4 or 5 minutes to work out, I think I'm feeling that.
Right.
Because when we are addicted, that's all we think about. And we usually don't know our emotions because that's what we're trying to squash or run away from or hide from. So to now have to be aware of how I'm feeling, of what I'm thinking, I think I spent the bulk of my addiction trying not to think. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And so now to have to turn that around, that came very much for me from, and the people that I see who do a good recovery, they're so self-aware. They know what they're thinking, what they're feeling, they know why they're trying to do what they do, and they know what makes them do what they do. And so the more that you learn about it, more power that you sort of tend to have over it. Alongside of that, you've got to then develop the tools to manage that.
Right.
But I think the important bit is first getting some awareness of, why do I do this? Why am I like this? And as you start to get your head around that, you kind of, okay, get it. And then the next question is, so how do I manage this?
Right. Yeah. And I've read this, that 30 days is a magic number to break a habit.
Right.
Does this apply in cases of addiction, or is it, again, on a spectrum where some people that might apply and some people it actually takes a lot longer?
For me, it was 2 years.
Right.
Okay. So I think, some addicts I know talk about, well, what's your main poison? So if we're poly-addicted, we're addicted to many things. There tends to be something that's the hardest to give up. And I tend to see a 2-year window as pretty normal to get to the point where you start to kind of go, okay, now I'm managing this. I don't want to be foolish and think that I've beaten it fully, because I always have to be careful. But in terms of feeling that, for me, around that 2-year mark, I had a moment where I kind of go, I'm not thinking about this all the time. And that feels really nice. I can think about other stuff. So I don't think that happens in a hurry. I think the other huge key is that it's important to stay connected to your recovery. I've seen lots and lots of people relapse, like lots of people. and I relapsed in my first year. And what it was you get to a place where you kind of go, I've drunk the medicine, I think I'm good, now I'm fixed. And when we disconnect from recovery, we become really vulnerable. So I know people who've gone 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, and then they've relapsed. And I can't think of one time at all, where I've said to them in the last, 6 weeks, 6 months, 12 months, what have you been doing around recovery? Have you been going to meetings? Have you been, is it a focus of your prayer? Do people in church still keep you accountable? And every time the answer is no,
Right.
because we get to the stage where we kind of go, I've got this. And then that little sneaky addictive thinking just slowly gets in there. She goes, yeah, you'll be right. So if you do this, you're fine because you're fixed now. And before you know it, we've kind of taken that step and that step and that step, and we end up where we were or worse. So I think that's a big part of it, is staying connected to our recovery and staying connected, whether it's a recovery community or a faith community, but a community that's going to keep you accountable and remind you that that's where you've been and you don't want to go back there.
So what are the consequences for those who fall into addiction?
Man, that's a big question. I think so. Obviously, there's physical consequences, there's financial consequences, particularly with gambling.
Sure.
I think there's emotional consequences, there's family consequences. There's not much that addiction doesn't touch. It's like this big monster that just eats everything it can because it takes a lot to feed it. So it will chew up and spit out everything around you in order to just stay alive. So I think probably a better question is, what does it not affect? It affects your work. It affects it affects family, affects health, it affects everything. For me, full-blown addiction I'm talking about. And so, I think there's not much that addiction doesn't touch, unfortunately.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
What about people who, because the way I see it is that, like you've said, addiction, if someone's addicted, it affects themselves but also everyone else around them.
Yeah.
Are some addictions worse than others? Like, is it worse to be addicted to something? Is that worse than being addicted to another thing?
It's a hard question. I think addiction, it doesn't matter what your addiction is, it's destructive. Some addictions more destructive than others? I think so. For instance, if I had a meth habit, that would be a lot more physically destructive to my body than my gambling addiction. But my gambling addiction is probably a lot more damaging financially than most of those other addictions, although not necessarily, depending how much you're using. So,
Sure.
I think the fallout from other things might be greater. It might affect in different ways. But I think ultimately all addiction, even if I'm just addicted to shopping, or food, it's going to get messy the worse it gets. Yeah.
Right.
But if you had to scale them, I guess there's some way you would know how to do that, but still not sure.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, I always viewed it through, and I'm kind of changing my mind on this as we have this conversation, but that if there was an addiction that negatively impacted those immediately around you, although I think all addictions do, but let's say you're a husband and you have a wife and kids and you have a really bad gambling addiction, and you end up gambling away savings and it negatively impacts your wife and kids. I think that, in my head, I think that's a worse addiction than someone who, let's say, has an eating addiction and it's only just impacting themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that the irony there is it's a myth, and the fact that addiction, we think in our heads that it's only affecting us, but it never only just affects us. So, for instance, you take the eating addiction. If that affects you to the point that physically now you can't work, now you're relying on the health system, there's an impact there. And there will be an impact probably to your family within that. Same as shopping, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely. I think just addiction in general, it always affects the people around you. But what happens is the same way that we recalibrate our lives in order to accommodate the addiction, 9 times out of 10, so does our family. So now they're kind of getting groomed, for want of a better word, to fit in with our addiction. And now we're making them sick as well, and they don't even know. We tend to help our family to be able to enable what we're doing, even if we're hiding it.
Yeah. Also, I think it's harmful in the way that, if because addiction, your whole brain is focused on how do I get more of this.
Yeah.
And I think it affects other people because you're not being the person that you could be if you weren't so focused on this. And if you were the person that you could be, how much good could you do for those around you? So I think even in terms of not necessarily what they are doing, but what they aren't doing because of their addiction, I think that also negatively impacts those around them.
I think that's the biggest cost you pay for addiction, as you become completely unavailable to people around you, particularly emotionally. And I remember, as I said, addiction ran in my family. I had a great dad, loved dad. Drinking was part of his lifestyle. I'm not going to go out there and define that as being a drinking issue. That would be for him to work out. But I do know that because of that being such an important part of his routines, that there were a lot of times where emotionally he kind of checked out. And I remember struggling with that as a kid. And I remember kind of going, man, I'll never do that. And then I become a dad. And at this stage, I've already recovered from my addictions. But I find that I don't know how to emotionally connect with my kids. And that I just took it for granted that because I'm not doing the stuff, I will be a person who's just available. And also, I've been a youth worker, and I've been I know how to be there for people. But when it came to my own kids, this deficit that was kind of passed on to me, I hadn't worked out how to solve that. So I had to learn how to play with my kids, how to not be thinking about other things when they were talking to me. Like it sounds simple, but it was so hard. There was stuff that, I don't know, you would think would just be normally there in people. It just wasn't there in me.
Right.
So I think addiction does that too. When we have people in our lives, or if addiction affects us and those people aren't available, then we learn how to not be available. We don't ever realise.
Right.
I think the other big part in terms of its fallout and effect is shame. Oh my goodness. I think that the biggest God job in my life was him getting the shame out of me. I didn't even know it was there. But we do some crazy stuff in the name of addiction. We hurt people, we hurt ourselves. And at a deep level, I'd never forgiven me for doing that. I knew that God had forgiven me, but I hadn't forgiven me. And he had to work really hard on that. And probably the best 10 years of my life had been the last 10, where God brought a real freedom to that. He says, you tell other people about this all the time, about what's possible in terms of forgiving yourself and turning over you. But yet there's something in you that if I put the spotlight back on that period of your life, you're still carrying shame around it. So that was a big release. And I think that's probably the thing that drives most people to keep using, I think, is we get reminded of our shame. And so in order to deal with that, because it's very painful, we don't want to think about it, we use to come again, to cover that up. So it's this crazy cycle.
Yeah, wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we continue, I just want to take this opportunity to talk to you about our online prayer ministry. When I'm going through a hard time or people I know are struggling, I always turn to prayer, whether that be my own personal prayer or asking someone else to pray over me. Philippians 4 says that through prayer we are to let all of our troubles known and that we will receive the peace of God. We have a prayer team standing by who are ready to help you in your prayer journey. In the description below this video, we have a link to our prayer request form which you can fill out, which tells our team what you need prayer for. As prayer is a very personal experience, we keep all of this highly confidential, which means your prayer is only shared between you, the prayer team, and God. So if you need prayer, I highly encourage you, click the link in the description and fill out your prayer request form today. What harmful addictive substance or behaviour do you think is most overlooked or normalised?
I think, thank goodness, we're living in a world now where we're starting to get our head around the fact that addiction is addiction. And it was a good question you asked before in terms of, can we rank addictions in terms of what's the worst and what's... I think as we're starting to get more understanding around recovery, we're understanding that, in a sense, anything can become addiction. So there's probably lots of things that... So, for instance, I talked about having a really addictive nature and learning how to live with that and manage that. Means that I can turn things that shouldn't be addiction into addiction.
Right.
So as a kid, I collected sports cards. Loved that. There's a gambling element to that because you're buying these packs of cards for the promise that you might hit a really big one in that pack. And so I returned to that hobby 6-7 years ago because I was bored when COVID hit. And I found really quickly that this thing was going to get out of control without the right boundaries around it, the right accountability. And so it's something that I really enjoy now. But every now and then my wife still has to say, "Oi, pull your head off," because there's a part of me that kind of goes, I just want to turn this into a thing, and I think that's the addictive nature. We get so fixated and so, what's the word, almost sort of just tunnel visioned on one thing that we just want to keep doing it all the time, and it doesn't have healthy balance to it. So I think there's probably, we can get addicted to anything.
Okay.
So rather than maybe the question about what are some things we need to be more aware of, it's probably been maybe asking the question, what is it that we find ourselves fixating on? Or what are the things that we tend to fixate on that can get bigger than us? And it's a hard question because there's probably things that aren't even out and out yet that are going to come. Anything that would want us to keep using it for more pleasure.
Right.
We haven't even talked about sexual addiction, but I think anything that comes with the promise of do this and feel better, potentially is something we've got to watch out for.
Yeah. There's something that I've noticed in terms of something that people are talking about it, but I think a lot of people are unaware of it, especially those who are quite involved in it.
Yeah.
Is this mix between social media and over-sexualization of things. I think it's a really dangerous mix where in any sort of advertising, things are very sexualized. People are very focused on just how they look because that's portrayed as the valuable thing in today's world, especially for younger people. Yeah. And they're on their phones scrolling social media all the time, and it's just obviously it depends what your algorithm gives you, but it seems like a lot of what's pushed is sexualized content.
Yeah.
And I feel as though that is something that's becoming normalized, and it's a very good stepping stone into something more harmful like pornography.
Yeah.
And I just don't really see a lot of people standing up and saying, hey, this is actually a problem. That social media on its own, yes, very addictive, but and also things that are sexualized, very addictive. But there's this meshing of the two things, and it doesn't seem to be called out as an issue.
I think we normalise to a degree all addiction. So when you think about alcohol, it's a depressant, and yet culturally, there's always been this debate around the legalisation of marijuana, which I find a fascinating debate because people are kind of going, well, the worst that I'm going to do is just kind of probably eat too much and fall asleep.
Yeah.
The point that we're missing in all of that is almost coming back to what you said before. Some things we normalise and we say societally this is okay, and other things that we don't, which is crazy. I mean, at one point, doing Coke was normal, like it was in Coca-Cola. And so in certain times and certain eras, we're not aware of the harm. And then so by the time we become aware of it, it's already so embedded in our culture that it's just about impossible to weed out. So you could have 1,000 people that said tomorrow, hey, alcohol was really harmful because it destroyed my life. We need to stop drinking alcohol. But there's no way that happens because A, not everybody's battling with it, and B, it's too embedded. And so when I think about the sexualisation of our culture, I think that's always been there.
Right.
But I think it's on steroids now because of social media. And I think it's the difference now is that it's appealing to a younger audience, whereas I think, just sexualisation, pornography, it doesn't matter what era I've grown up, and that's always been prevalent.
Right. But
the shape of it has changed, and the target audience has changed. So it's getting younger and younger and younger, and so we have less ability. We normalise it at a younger age, but the same could be said about drinking and drugs or whatever. I had a laugh this morning. I went to I caught up with a colleague. And they have a school program that looks after kids before, this is a cool like Oscar or something before they go to school. And there was this little kid, and he was like 5 years old, and his school bag was bigger than him, And this girl runs over to him. She must have been like 5 or 6 too, and she goes, "Hey, such and such, have you got a crush on blah blah?" And this little kid, who's like 5, he just goes, "Oh, no," and runs away. And what hit me was like, man, that's stuff that we wouldn't have had to deal with until we were like at least 10.
At least.
At least 10. And I don't know what to do with that when I was 15, And that's what I see happening is stuff is in our grill. We're having to deal with it at ages that we never had to before. So is there more sexualisation? Is there more addiction? I don't know, but it certainly gets broadcasted bigger.
Right.
Yeah.
It just makes me feel a bit sad for people, especially for girls who think that all of their worth and value is in just how they look.
Yeah.
And how much attention they can bring because of how they're dressed and things like that. And hello, this is Ethan from the future. I'm just editing this podcast episode, and I just want to say if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate the support. Now, unfortunately, our video camera ran out of storage at this point in the episode, but you can continue to listen on. Thank you. And it almost seems like, well, particularly in America, that the value of people is based off their sexual experience or how mature they seem sexually or something around that. But it makes me sad because as Christians, there's so much more to us than just the body that we've been given, right? It just makes me feel sad when I see people who put all of their value in how they look.
Yeah.
And for me, I just want to say that they so much more than just that. But it's hard for them to understand that because their environment that's what's valued.
That's what's valued. Yeah. It's and that's the challenge, right, for us as Christians is to first of all know that where does our value come from? Psalm 121, right? I look to the hills, I look to all the stuff around me, but ultimately, where does my help come from? And in that same instance, where does my worth come from? Where's my value? Who gives that to me? And if you don't have an answer for that question, you're waiting for someone to tell you what it is, right? And so I guess as Christians, we've got to make sure we can answer that really firmly for ourselves, and also be a resource to help people answer that too. Because I guess that's the heart of it, right? If everybody is looking for value, for worth, for a sense that I'm okay, and if stuff's not okay, then you kind of go looking somewhere to make it feel okay. It's a tough one.
Yeah, for sure. What can loved ones do to help those who have addiction problems?
Oh, that's hard, man. You've got this. Well, for me, I look back at me in the peak of my addiction, and I kind of go, there was probably nothing that they could have done. Could they have had stronger boundaries and enabled me less? Probably, but I would have kept doing it. Could they have tried to push me into recovery? Probably, but I wouldn't have stuck. It's a real hard one because you're at the mercy of this thing, right?
Yeah.
Probably the thing I would say, Ethan, is the best thing a family member can do is probably not say, what can I do to fix my person, but how do I survive this? What can I do to help me?
Right.
In hindsight, because you're kind of like you're surviving the storm, right? And you can't do anything about it. So it's kind of like I would urge people to get into recovery themselves for learning how to recover from their addicted person. Find some support groups, dig out Al-Anon or Gam-Anon, which are groups specifically to help family members, because it's now become your problem. Their problem becomes your problem, and that's the problem.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So there's it's a hard one. I'd love to tell you, hey, here's some things you can do, and this is going to magically help your loved one. But there's a period of time in my life where, honest to God, it wouldn't have mattered what you did. Nothing would have helped and nothing would have worked. By the grace of God, He brought me to it, but nothing that my family. But in saying that, I still needed to know deeply that they loved me.
Yeah.
Not that they approved of what I was doing, but that I was still lovable. Because you destroy that, you make such a mess of things that you go, there's no way that anybody in their right mind would love that, because we kind of go, we attach loving and approving of together. That's where we get in trouble. If they love me, then, they'd have to sort of approve of this, and they can't. But you can do one without the other, right? Love the sin and not the sin, So I guess my advice would be, probably you can do nothing, but there's lots you can do for you, because now you've got this problem, whether you like it or not, that your loved one's addiction is affecting your life, if not wrecking it. So now I'm broken too. So the question is not how do I fix them, but how do I fix me? And if it hasn't destroyed me yet, how do I keep it from not? And the way I learn that is by connecting with other people who are going through that too.
Right.
And I learn with them and I learn from them.
Okay. What about someone who has recognised their addiction and is aware of it and are just trying to figure it out?
Yeah, I would say good luck with that. Because if we had the ability to do that, we would have done that a long time ago. There are times where we feel like we're doing that. We kind of go, I've got the system on top of it. If I just do this and this and this. But I heard this powerful thing a little while ago, and it was a recovery church that the Salvation Army runs, and I was there because I was asked to speak, and they've coined a new phrase, and I really love it. They're saying that there's new, I guess, sort of thinking and science around recovery now, and they're saying we used to say that the opposite of addiction is sobriety. Now we say the opposite of addiction is connection. So the more that we are connected properly and learning what it means to be connected properly to people, the less we're likely to use. So they talked about this incredible experiment. Well, it wasn't an experiment, really. It was just a thing that happened in the Vietnam War. That when American troops were over in Vietnam, heroin use was just through the roof.
Right.
So they were saying that possibly as high as 1 in 3 soldiers at one point may have been using heroin just to survive the atrocities of that war.
Mm.
Everybody was freaking out. When all these troops come home, we're going to have this national pandemic, and we don't know what to do. So they try to ready themselves for it. And 6 months in, there's nowhere near the traffic that they get.
Right.
Because what's happened is now that they're out of that environment that was causing them to use, and they're back connected with their family. Some people continue to, struggle and need help with it, but as a bulk, it wasn't near the fallout that they thought it was going to be. And so a science guy did this experiment with rats way back, and had a rat go and choose if he wanted this addicted, they laced it with something, water or normal water. And over time, he sort of went from one to the other and said the lesson here is obviously, unless you stay away from that, that's bad. So that's what we learned then. When it comes to addiction, you've got to stay away from what's bad. And then another guy came along 20 years later, and he said, it's a real dumb experiment. And he said, because the rat's by itself. So he created this rat park full of things that rats love, right? Rat heaven, full of all these things they love to eat and do and all the rest of it, and then had the 2 bottles at the end of Rat Park. And they found that not once was the addicted substance ever touched by the rat.
Wow.
Yeah, because he was in community, and he was in a healthy community with, I find that fascinating. Absolutely changes the way that I think about addiction. So you can see that, that's why, coming back to your original point, I don't think people get better by themselves. Mm. We think we can, but it's you only get better in community. That's my experience.
Right.
That's what I was saying.
Mm.
Yeah.
I can imagine that is probably one of the hardest steps for people, especially if they've kept their addiction to themselves, is they're battling against that shame.
It's that back to that shame thing again. Yeah. And that's what tends to keep us trapped in the cycle. It's the shame of it all. Mm. And the pride too, Ethan, having to kind of take that first step to say, this thing's beating my butt. Mm. Nobody wants to lose or feel like you can't win somehow. Mm-hmm. That's what kept me. Right. I knew I had a problem, but I wanted to be able to at least have some measure of control before I said help. Mm-hmm. But that just never came. Yeah.
Yeah, the image that comes into my mind is that when you keep an addiction to yourself, it has places to hide.
Oh, yeah.
But the moment you tell other people, it's brought into the light and it has nowhere to hide. Because people know about it now.
Yeah.
And if you're someone that's wanting to recover, then, other people can keep you accountable and they can say, hey, how's that going? Or, hey, I'm noticing this happening. And so it really doesn't have anywhere to hide. So I think, when I was thinking about this conversation and trying to think about what advice you could possibly give to someone that recognizes their addiction but just doesn't know where to go, is that the shame and the pride really have to come down in order for you to take that step forward. And it probably feels like the hardest step to take.
It's terrifying. I remember the first time that I stepped forth with that, and that would have been the day after my toilet encounter, that I went to this group for the first time. And it was the most terrifying and liberating at the same time thing that's ever happened to me. because the words for the first time came out of my mouth. My name's Andrew, and I'm addicted to gambling. And I knew that. That wasn't new to me, but I'd never said it out loud before. And I think that's part of the power of AA, GA, is that you're putting voice to what's real and what's true. And you are right, you can't hide it anymore. But the addiction gets us foothold because it sort of says, under no circumstance do you want to do that, because that's the most humiliating, embarrassing, painful thing you could ever do. So avoid that. Don't do that. Do everything but. Try a bit harder on your own. You'll get there. But the addiction knows that if you can get to that point, you bust it wide open. You might have to do that again and again and again and again for the rest of your life. But it's what keeps you owning it. It's what keeps you honest. Is not hiding it. But getting to that point, boy, that's hard.
Right.
It just feels like the worst thing in the world that you could ever want to do. Because like you've lost, right? You've failed. Yeah.
So what hope would you give to people who are, and loved ones, who are currently addicted to something but are actively trying to better themselves?
Yeah, I would say the hope comes from sharing it. Who's the safe person in your life that you can kind of go, I'm pretty sure what's happening here is this, and being able to name it. If you're a family member, you might not be able to name it for the person. If somebody had tried to say to me, hey, you're a compulsive gambler, I wouldn't want that label. But that's what I was.
Sure.
Somebody who gambled compulsively. And so being able to share it, start to give it words and a voice and a name is the best thing you can do. So it's trying to find out who's safe for me. Who can I go to and say, I don't know what I call it, and if I call it addiction, all I know is that this thing is kicking my butt and it's making my life miserable, or it's hindering this, or it's hindering that. I enjoy it, I like it, but the cost is too high, because eventually the cost always gets too big, right?
Right.
So yeah, share it. The hope comes from sharing, from being able to sort of reach out and sort of say, I think I've got this thing. And if you reach out to a safe person, they won't try and solve that for you, but they will help you to kind of go, what do you need to do next? And if you genuinely don't know what to do next, ask, say to your person, I don't know what to do next. Help me find out. Or we all know the stuff on TV, that's a silly thing. I knew there was an alcohol helpline. I knew there was a gambling helpline, but I wasn't calling it. But if I'm confiding in Ethan, you're my mate, and for whatever reason I felt I've been brave enough and you've been safe enough to say, Ethan, dude, what am I going to do? This thing's kicking my butt. That in that moment I'm able to hear, you probably need to ring this person or start here. And you might say, dude, I'll sit here. What do you call it? Or I will go with you, even though I'm not an addict, to your first AA meeting or your first GA meeting, if that's what you want, this is what it takes. But if we can just get there, then you can make a start. Yeah.
Well, it's been a really good conversation with you, Andrew. I've really appreciated it a lot, and I hope those who listen and watch also get a lot out of it. Is there any last message or anything that you might have coming up that you want people to know about?
Probably just, I hope this is helpful, because this is just my experience and my opinion of it. There might be experts out there shaking their head going, no, that's terrible advice, Andrew, that's awful. So I guess my thing would be, this is just how I've encountered recovery, how it's been to me, what I've noticed. And there are great resources, even bigger and better than me, around this stuff, which I think is the encouraging thing, is that there are lots of places to go for help. There's lots of science around the stuff now. So we just need to feel safe and sort of seeking that out.
Well, Andrew, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, man. It's been great.
Cool. Cheers.